back to the ConfigMgr Technical Preview Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Zenert. As always, you can catch me on Twitter at @thezenerd. You can catch me on the WinAdmins Discord. And this spring, you can catch me at MMS MOA, Midwest Management Summit. If you didn't get your tickets already, I'm sorry. You missed out. They are sold out. However, you might still have a chance to catch one on a couple of different Twitter feeds, or if you're not as lucky as some other people are, you can catch us in the fall at the Midwest Management Summit in San Diego or Midwest Management Summit Midway. If you're new to this podcast, it's a general overview of everything that's come out in the latest technical preview for ConfigMgr. Nothing here is guaranteed, but a lot of these features do make it into the final product when they are released 3 times a year. And as always, you can learn all of this stuff in the Microsoft Docs, but again, like I said last time, I'm one of those people that likes to just hear somebody tell me about it rather than read documents sometimes. So this podcast is for you in that case. And wouldn't you know it, a day after I released my last podcast, Technical Preview 2002 came out. So I've been writing that script and getting ready for this podcast. Another one absolutely knocked out of the park by the ConfigMgr team. So let's get down to it. Let's take a look at my top 3 new features or revised features for ConfigMgr Technical Preview 2002. Coming in at number 1, a feature that's been requested by a lot of people. It's the ability to install servicing stack updates before the rest of the updates in a group apply. So ConfigMgr now checks to see if there's a servicing stack update as part of an installation of multiple updates. It will first install the servicing stack update, and then it will reevaluate software updates to see if anything else is applicable. So for those months when a servicing stack update is required before a cumulative update can be applied, it will reevaluate to make sure that those updates are detected as necessary as well. And no reboot necessary in between the servicing stack update and the rest of the updates. Now, while this was introduced in Technical Preview 2002, it does have some limitations, namely, it doesn't apply to user-initiated installs. So when your users go through Software Center and click to install individual updates or even click to install all updates, the process is different on the client side than it would be for a mandatory update, and therefore this process doesn't run. So I was told I need to send a Frowny so that I can give my feedback, so let's go ahead and do that right now. Come over here to my console. I've got all my feedback already typed up and just would love to see the servicing stack update feature have the ability to detect, even on user-initiated install, all updates. I get that it's not going to work when a user installs updates individually. It just doesn't make sense. But basically, anytime an SSU is part of a collection of updates being applied, have the SSU apply first and have that same redetection process execute before continuing. So we'll go ahead and submit that feedback now. And my feedback has been submitted. I did attach my email address this time, that way I can track it for future revisions. Alright, coming in at number 2 is improvements to the ConfigMgr Pixie responder. It now sends status messages to the console to make troubleshooting operating system deployment easier. So let's take a look at that really quick. Okay, so after an hour and a half troubleshooting break on why my management point wasn't working, turns out having a child who has access to the power cord on your lab server is never a great idea. He may or may not have unplugged my server a couple of times and my management point stopped working. Anyways, we're back taking a look at the ConfigMgr console here. We've got our status message queries. Let's go ahead and try to Pixie boot a machine here. So we'll pull up my virtual machine and we're going to go ahead and give her a good old-fashioned Microsoft fix, also known as a reboot. And this is configured to attempt to boot Pixie first. So what we should see as soon as this reboots here is an attempt to log in. What we're going to see here is nothing happens because this device actually has no task sequences advertised to it. If we come back to our ConfigMgr lab and run this status message query that I've created for SMS Pixie Service Point. You can do it from all status messages, but this is just going to filter out directly to this particular component. So we'll go ahead and run this SMS Pixie Service Point report here and show all messages. And if we zoom out, we'll see the Pixie Service Point instructed the boot device to boot normally, or instructed device to boot normally, since it has no Pixie deployment assigned. So you can see how this would make things a little bit easier to troubleshoot when your users or your technicians rather are telling you the Pixie isn't working on a device. So really cool here to create this status message query that I created. If we come into the properties and take a look at the query statement, all we're telling it is just to look for status message component that is equal to SMS underscore pixie underscore service underscore point. That's a lot of underscores. Basically, it's just looking for that component in the status message query, and you'll get that from every one of your systems at that point that happens to have the pixie service point enabled on it. All right, coming in at number 3, we've got improvements to Microsoft Edge management in the console. You can now enable Edge to update itself. This is important because we've got new features coming out for Edge approximately every 6 weeks, in addition to security updates released as needed, which is a pretty hard cadence to keep up if you're pushing updates only once a month, or maybe even twice a month. Now these updates are 70 to 80 megabytes apiece. I'm not sure if there's any reduction having Edge update itself. I suspect there might be, but something to be aware of for your network team for sure. Most environments it probably won't affect it. So let's take a look at this in the console and how you can enable it. All right, coming back into the console here, we're going to go to the software library and then right click on Microsoft Edge Management and choose Create Microsoft Edge Application. We're going to need to give it a name. We'll call this Edge Dev, since I'm going to do the dev channel here. And we need to give it a location to store it on my server. That's going to be TP-Lab Content Microsoft Edge Dev. And we'll choose the dev channel. And you'll notice here this new checkbox is exposed in the console. Allow Microsoft Edge to automatically update the version of the client on the end user's device. Pretty cool, really simple to enable. If you happen to download or create a package and not check that box, I'll show you how to change that here. If we go into our applications section, or the location where that application may have been moved if you have folders, and we'll take a look at this Edge Stable package and come into our deployment types. We have 2 different deployment types, one for x86 and one for x64. If we right click and choose properties on the deployment type and come over to the programs tab, you'll notice that it's actually just executing PowerShell script here called install Edge. And one of the properties on that PowerShell script is do auto update, and we can set this to true or false. So if it's currently false and you want to enable auto update, set it to true. If it's currently true and you want to disable auto updates for new installs of the application, we'll set it to false. All right, so that covers my top 3. Let's talk about the rest. We've got additional improvements to the task sequence progress UI. So you remember that step counter that's being introduced to the progress. Based on community feedback of people who are testing technical preview, they've removed some steps from count. Number 1, they removed the group step because it's just a container of steps from the count, so we don't have to worry about that. They've removed the run task sequence step, which is effectively another container of steps, so the same thing going on there. And then additionally, explicitly disabled steps are now excluded from the count. However, if you've got a disabled group and steps within that group that are enabled, those steps will still be counted even though the group is disabled. So I'm hoping maybe that will change for Technical Preview 2003 or potentially the release of the next current branch version. Next, we have some additional improvements to orchestration groups, or as I've heard some of you like to call it, device orchestration groups, or DOGs. These improvements include being able to clear the state of a orchestration group member so that you can rerun the orchestration. Updates requiring a reboot are now supported, so that's excellent. And then you can now start basic operations like Resource Explorer or enable verbose logging for selected members. So let's take a look at that in the console. All right, so back in our console, if we open up Assets and Compliance, look at the orchestration group and double click on the orchestration group, we'll see we've got our device here in waiting state currently. If we right click on it and select Reset Orchestration Group Member, we will have the option to reset the orchestration group member's state. And by doing that, it should reset the current state of the device and allow it to continue or restart the orchestration group. Additionally, if we right click on the device, we should be able to start Resource Explorer remote control. Right now this is grayed out in my console and I'm not entirely sure why, so I'm going to go ahead and submit a frown here because this just isn't working as I'm expecting it to. I could just be doing something wrong here, but we'll go ahead and submit that frowny so the team knows that it's not working the way that I want it to. We got our feedback here. Cannot access basic operations on an orchestration group member. We'll go ahead and include a screenshot that shows that as well in my email address, and we'll hit the submit feedback button, and boom, feedback has been submitted. All right, next up on the list, we have proxy support for Azure AD Discovery as well as group synchronization. So if you use proxies in your environment, the proxy configured on the site server will now be used for Azure AD user and group discovery, as well as collection right back into Azure AD groups. All right, another feature that I am super stoked about is improvements to BitLocker management within the console. I used to do a lot of MBAM deployments back in the day, but I'm super excited to be able to do those just with ConfigMgr deployments now and not have to have additional hardware. So the improvements bring additional policies that you can now configure for clients, including fixed and removable drive policies. So let's take a look at those in the console really quick. All right, coming back into our console, if we go to Assets and Compliance, expand Endpoint Protection, and right-click on BitLocker Management, we can create BitLocker management control policies. You'll see here now we have some additional features, fixed drive and removable drive. Let's call this BitLocker policy and take a look at those. We'll step over here to fixed drive. These policies, again, should be pretty familiar to you. It's just now exposed in the management control policy for BitLocker, allowing access to protected fixed data drives from earlier versions of Windows, password policies, encryption policies, and the same goes for removable drives, whether or not you can enable. Again, like I said, these policies should be familiar to you if you've used MBAM before. It's just available to you now to manage within ConfigMgr rather than group policy. All right, coming in at last but not least, we have Office 365 updates for disconnected software update points. Maybe you're in an environment where your software update point doesn't have access to the internet. You weren't able to deploy Office 365 updates before, and that's because those updates required additional metadata to be downloaded from the Office API as well as the Office Content Delivery Network. And I suspect that's the same reason why Office 365 updates don't work in a traditional WSUS only environment, meaning you're not using ConfigMgr with WSUS. All right, so to make this happen, we have a new tool called the Offline Updates Exporter. To do this, you've got a number of prerequisites. You're going to need an internet-connected WSUS server at some place in your environment. Obviously, it's not going to be your software update point in this case. You need direct connectivity to the Office CDN as well as config.office.com. You're going to need the tool. The executing user of the tool needs to be a member of the WSUS admins group. The directory that you're exporting these updates to needs to be empty, and Microsoft also calls out that these updates should be moved securely. I'm not entirely sure the reason behind that, but best to trust Microsoft in this case. I'm not going to go over the entire process here in this podcast, but the general process is synchronizing the Office 365 updates with your WSUS server and then declining the ones that you're not going to be publishing. You're going to export those using the tool, and then you're going to import the updates on your software update point, which requires a PowerShell script, which is laid out in the documentation. And additionally, it requires a restart of the SMS executive service on the site server. So probably would be best to do this after hours rather than during business hours. All right, some known issues for the tool at this point. Local paths only. You can't export the updates to a network share. And then the big caveat here is content for all languages is downloaded for every update, and that could be as much as 10 gigabytes per update. So not an optimal solution. I'm sure the ConfigMgr team is working on that, and it's just going to get better on the next iteration of this tool. But a really cool option if you have disconnected software update points, you can now manage Office 365 updates at the same time. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of the ConfigMgr Technical Preview Podcast. As always, if you've got questions or comments, leave them down in the comment field on this video. I try to get back to those as soon as possible. And until we meet next time, happy previewing.